got some load management stuff today, go through the some results, and I look forward to this week because there's a couple of races on as well. And then we'll do a wins of the week and tie it up with some question and answers as usual. Morning, Chris, or evening again.
Morning to you, afternoon to me. Are you well?
Yeah, good. Ready to talk some load management since it's pretty much bread and butter. I actually had a conversation yesterday from a rehab perspective with our band 7 physio here, and we're just very much on the same page that there's so much shite about what load actually is and what actually constitutes the management of it and why things go wrong and why most injuries and overload occurs is probably because of a load management issue rather than a training or an error that you can't fix. So people looking for reasons not to blame themselves or their training for their injuries or burnout or lack of progress. Let's get straight into the last week's races then, just to tie that up. So there were quite a few, some different ones. So Guadalajara in Mexico. Oh, I bet you must spell Spanish there. Vienna and Bilbao. So some big names racing. Vienna obviously is the hometown of the big man Ronk. He was supposed to race and didn't, and just did the open and cruised around there in a little tempo run, I think, and then race with his girlfriend the day after for fun. He obviously loves racing there and soaking up the atmosphere. And there's some serious races going on. Multiple people racing almost every weekend, and obviously they're trying to scoop up points. Tom Turvik there picked up another batch of points, taking the win in 54 minutes, so fast enough when I think there were some cheeky sleds banging around, or that was the word on the street. And then there was some harsh over judging, I think, coming out from what I heard. And I think, not to, call out the judges again, but I saw some videos of some of the over judging. I think Liam McCrory got pretty harshly handled as well after trying to find out his number and slowed him down even further after trying to take the penalties off him. So he got over 2 minutes worth of penalties with very little warning from what he said. So I don't know, another little X against the over judging there.
Yeah, I think we talk about it a bit, and I think it's like a pendulum. I think you'd say 2 years ago people were probably getting away with too much, and I think it's swung back the other way now, where it's not all judges. I don't think it's ever done with malice. I think some just probably think they are out there to do a job, but I think, I've heard it said before that, they're sort of hunting for penalties. They are looking to penalise, and it's like, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that, technically speaking, I mean, it's almost impossible to completely parallel with feet and the burpees, and it can be difficult to judge. Ball depth, as you said last week, people are, anatomically different. If people's chest comes forward, it can sometimes make them look like they're not scoring to depths. I don't think there's any malice in the judging, but I do think it's something that Hyrox needs to tidy up, because we're talking about it too much. We should be talking about load management, and it does take up a lot of the conversations on some of the podcasts, and I don't think it's unwarranted. I don't think it's just whinging. Like you obviously know Liam and have spoken to him personally, and for someone to go through a career having been seldomly penalised, and all of a sudden to just be whacked with it. It's not like he's gone out in that race and changed the way he moves. He's obviously just got to judge that he's seeing something subjective, and once they start it, they don't stop.
Something I will say though with the burpees, and we talked about it yesterday, is to do yourself a favour. And if you're going to do the step up method or the kneel up method, if you want to call it that, leave your hand on the floor, or leave one hand on the floor when you bring your feet up. That way the judge can see that your feet haven't gone past your hand, which at the minute seems to be something they're picking up on as well, which fair play, because if you take your hands off the floor before you put both your feet forward, you can really get a good foot extra on there, at least.
Yeah.
So do yourself a favour with a bit of integrity and leave one hand on the floor so that you can see that your foot is behind your fingertips. It's a simple thing, and you can only need to leave one hand, so it doesn't really factor into the issue, a mobility issue that much. Bring one knee up and then bring your foot forward in line with your hand, instead of trying to sneak those extra few inches. And even if you're not, you may not realise you're doing it, whereas your hand can be a good marker to do it. That's a probably a helpful little tip just to think about. Cool. And then Bilbao, quite a few went down there. I don't know. Harry Thompson dropped a 54 and was absolutely, the runs looked super quick and the rock zone didn't look massive. And even on the open in the morning, I think the winner of the open, his runs were crazy fast. So I don't know if it was nice and cool in there or if it was just a nice clear track. We can debate that for ages, but I think the sleds again in the afternoon or the evening for the pros, the push stopped a lot of people in their track. I think Graham Halliday had a nightmare 3.5 minutes on his push and was happy to say that. I think his pull was faster all the same time as his push, which you don't see very often. So tight enough. But yeah, another big race. And I think some big names there as well, picking up points. Harry's another big lump of points, especially after Manchester. And then I think he's heard that he's going out with Luke Greer in Katowice next week for a pro doubles time to try and get in that regionals time. So there'll be, I think John and Bo are racing as well, eh?
Yeah, so they're going to get a time, and they're both obviously coming down for the APAC regional. Yeah, look, they're obviously both good athletes. They don't have to run a particularly fast time. We talk about this on another episode. Yeah, there's probably will be a bit of an issue with filling the spots for the APAC doubles. Just a lot of the guys that have qualified don't have that pro license. There are a few races, and I'm sure they'll probably get close. It might end up being a situation a little bit like the female elite 15, and just guys just didn't know. Like people that perhaps don't have real elite 15 aspirations have run a 54, 55 minute at some point, not knowing they needed an elite license for that time to count to go to Brisbane. And look, there are a few people, obviously Bo and John are doing Katowice, and then there's a Taipei race coming up, and a couple of guys who didn't race the pro solo in Auckland to punch a time. So there'll be a good field. I know James Kelly's racing with someone. He told me offline, and I don't know if he's announced yet, but there'll be some good teams, and it will be a good race. But probably just not the depth you'd want to see. And yeah, there's plenty of guys that have run decent times that are getting quicker, but just not having that elite license, they won't be able to participate in that.
Yeah, cool. I think Lena Putters won the female race there as well on a sub-60 time as well. So, decent fast course, some more points so that not the time matters too much, but it's nice on the resume to have a sub-60 pro female time in it. And then the last race there was in Guadalajara in Mexico. So still pretty new down there, I think. So some of them, Peleo went down and won the men's race in 60 minutes and got his 105 points, but still the elusive sub-60 fails Mexico. Well, I think Mexico City's over 2,000 meters of elevation, so it's never going to happen there. And then the venues, I imagine, are pretty warm and sticky because it's just always hot there, isn't it?
So that was a decent time. I was listening to a podcast this morning or yesterday. So Ryan Callahan, that ran second, ran a 61.29. He ran a 56 in Phoenix. It's hard to, it's not horses, of course, but it is. It's worth noting it's a pretty solid time, and players obviously coming back from injury. So to run to Hyrox math and say he would have definitely, and I think Ryan Callahan came fourth in Phoenix. So you'd have to think that the player feels like he's in pretty good shape. I think he's sort of stayed. He's really sort of dialed in just to go for that doubles with Rich, and 4 or 5 months. You'd think that they're going to be pretty sharp at World Championships.
Yeah, decent. All right, cool. Let's get into load management then and what it is and what we think. So I think we talked about it probably quite a bit last week in the sense of how we apply stress and deal with stress, and that all stress is an exposure to the body that's going to have some kind of effect. And so if we go back to even like the earlier stuff on general adaptation syndrome, and I'd released some stuff this week on how applying any stress to the body is still a stress and has a negative effect or a positive effect, depending if it's handled well and absorbed and recovered from. Our bodies can't separate load or stress in any way, so we have to be careful with how much we put on the body so that we can give it enough stress to adapt, but not to exhaust it and go backwards. We need to look at it in a holistic whole life picture, and be aware that things like sleep and nutrition and work-life balance are all accounted for when you're worrying about your training. So we don't need to just look at how we apply training. We need to how that is applied within the bigger picture of how we're doing. And I know you use HRV and that as a marker with Morpheus to say what kind of state you're in to be able to apply more stress, because some of that stress isn't quite visible, or we don't think of it as a stress that we can manage day to day or week on top of week. So I don't know if you want to talk about how you kind of use that within your system.
Yeah, it might be worth even just like fundamentally saying what are we applying load for? I mean, what are we trying to do? And I guess we're trying to improve our fitness, and you can obviously it's a Hyrox podcast and we're both Hyrox coaches and that's what we're passionate about. I mean, we are the whole purpose of what we're trying to do to applying training load or training stimulus is to try to improve improve fitness. I sort of say to people, well, what is fitness? It's basically an improved resilience. A very broad definition. Financial fitness is if you're resilient against any financial stress, and much like the fitness we're talking about is how resilient are you to performing in a race. And the whole purpose of training and applying any load is to improve that fitness. And then when I talk to any athlete I take on, I always say that like my job as a coach is to apply the last amount of possible maximum stress that I can apply as a coach, because your body doesn't really give a fuck about what's on the training plan. It only knows total stress. It's like you've only got a cup that you can fill so high before it overflows. And as much as we all love and live for training, it's really the last stress that your body has the ability to adapt from. So if you're fortunate enough, and I'm fortunate enough to train some athletes that more or less do it full time and can devote their entire life to training and recovery, but I also coach many people that have full-time jobs that are working 50 hours, have 2 kids, and they just cannot adapt to as much stress as someone that has a higher ability to tolerate load. So I think that's sort of a good starting point. Like, what are we applying load for? And it's obviously, as you said, it's to create an adaptation, but there's only so much that we can adapt to, and that comes down to how much other stress, as you really well articulated. Like, stress is stress. You can't compartmentalize it. If you've had a horrible day at work and you work in sales and you've got budgets and it's end of month, and you've got to put in a massive shift at work, you probably then can't do a double threshold day, or you can't do multiple. You probably can't have the training week that you want to, because your body has to deal with the stress of work, of life, those things, or even it has the ability to tolerate any sort of hard training stress.
I like the glass full, and there's only a top point where you start to overflow. But I think if we think about it in if you look at the Tim Gabbett stuff, and he used arbitrary units, so it only looked at arbitrary units across a training stress for an acute training stress and a chronic training stress, and the difference between them, and where we went outside of that, it became intolerable, and we went into the exhaustion phase, and we just went downhill after that. And you need to pull back, to be able to then adapt that, or absorb that stress to carry on. But if we look at it as imagine a normal person has 1,000 arbitrary units a week that they can recover from. So if you take those 1,000 units and we use 600 of them for normal daily day-to-day tasks, and then we've got 400 we can use for training, but then all of a sudden we get sick and we need to use 100 of those arbitrary units to deal with getting sick, and we still apply another 400 units of training stress, we're at 1,100 units then. So we're 10% over what we can apply, with this potential for us to be breaking then. Instead of doing that, realize that we're sick and that we can only apply 300 units that week. So you can still train, but you need to train at less intensity or with less volume in order to absorb those 1,000 arbitrary units. And the goal is obviously with training to increase those arbitrary units so that we can handle more. So, but we can't do it overnight. You have to do it chronically over time. So the goal is to go to, 1,050 units and then 1,100 units and build up slowly like that so that we can accumulate more. The problem is people try and go from 500 units to 1,500 units in 6 months. And 4, maybe 3 months of that, you will survive. You'll feel like shit, but there's no longevity in that, because chronically you will absolutely dig yourself a hole you can't get out of. So we need to progressively overload the body with stress, as we do with training. Being mindful that our chronic stress and our acute stress need to be linked so that we can build them both slowly. but by applying the right amount at the right time, whilst listening to the body or listening to HRV if you aren't in tune with your body. And because there's stuff underlying that you might not see that doesn't feel like stress that you need to be aware of. So people just looking at training and seeing it on a plan and going, right, it's on the plan, I need to do it, else I'm not going to get the gains I want because we need to overload that way. It's not how it works. We need to be dynamic with it. So if you wake up one morning and you feel like shit, but you've got a fresh old session plus a strength endurance session that day, just don't do it. Be mindful that that stress is not going to be good stress then. Like, you're going to apply a stress when you're close to your maximum amount of tolerable load. So push the session a day, push the session 2 days, or completely chin the session off and forget about it. It's one micro session within a giant amount of work that's going to make very little difference. So I think just being pragmatic with the information you've got, whether you take that information from the way you feel or the way your resting heart rate is, HRV in your case, just take that information and use it to make smart choices. Don't be a slave to what's on the paper or on your app because that's written down, because the person who wrote it, even if it's you, didn't know how you'd feel on that day. So
Yeah.
we're smart, but we can't see into the future.
Yeah, I like that. And I think there's probably two concepts that are important to touch on and to define, which are the concepts of overload and progressive overload. And I think people often conflate the two or think they're the same, and they're not. And you've articulated well, there is quite an important difference. So in terms of overload, it's like the acute stress. So a really good example is like a threshold session. So a typical threshold session might be 4 sets of 7 minutes with 90 seconds rest. So the overload is basically the stimulus in that. So if you're doing it on a treadmill, it's a pace that I use heart rate. So you've got to basically provide enough stimulus or overload in that session to get the training effect you want. So you want to be running at threshold pace, and I'm sure there's many episodes in threshold, but running at a pace that your body is learning to both produce lactate and clear it at a rate that you can sustain for around about an hour. So that is the acute overload. If we make it simple from like a strength perspective, 5x5 back squats at 85% of 1 RM is typically enough to provide some strength overload. People often think that you need to progressively overload every week. And that is a mistake. And that is why you often see people just adding, I'm not going to say junk volume, it's not always, but the desire to just add volume or add intensity every week. And I get this question a bit. I mean, I program in 3-week blocks with 1 week deload, and even whether it's an elite athlete I train or on my training app, they don't get a different program for 3 weeks. And I have had this question, well, how do I get progressive overload? Well, you don't need progressive overload in 3 weeks. You may not need progressive overload for 6 months, theoretically. As long as you are getting sufficient overload in that session, because again, we are looking for a training stimulus and then that response. And you're not always going to see significant improvements week to week. I mean, what's happening under the surface? You're increasing mitochondrial density. You're increasing that lactate buffering, but it doesn't show up in an immediate performance increase, particularly the higher you get as an athlete. Obviously, if you're a more novice or intermediate athlete, you might see improvements week on week. But certainly the higher you get to your performance ceilings, you're not going to see improvements week to week. So it might take you 6 months to progressively overload your program. Again, if you're doing 20 hours a week, which some people are, it's foolish to think that you should be getting to, say, 25 by the end of the year. You haven't, and that goes the same for someone doing 8, 10, 12 hours. You don't need to be one of these volume monsters that just thinks volume is the answer to everything. It's ideally you want to extract as much progress from the volume you're currently doing and then use volume as a tool to increase progress. It's not always going to work the other way. But, you just see people that I think they do volume for volume's sake so they can post their Strava week at the end of the week and do 22 hours. It's you force yourself to do a 6-hour ride on Sunday so you could post your Strava. It's not really effective training. You probably would have been better off just taking the day off, doing some food prep.
I think the best thing to do is to find a tolerable load for you for volume. So if everyone's different because of their lifestyles. And just to post like I did 20, 25 hours, if you only do that for 2 or 3 weeks, the actual advantage of it is bugger all. You need to find a tolerable load that you can maintain for a long time. Doing all these, there's quite a few studies showing that spike weeks don't really have much impact on overall performance, but they do on a potential injury rate. So if you were putting big spikes of load in, you just increase that chronic to acute distribution and open yourself up to potential injuries or burnout, which at the end of the day is completely pointless. It's like well, I'll talk about wins a week in a minute. It's this testing of like, or just pushing the boundary all the time. Push it, but like you only need to push it a little bit at a time. And work up through it. You have to be patient and build through layers. If you don't, you can't go from like apprentice to elite in 6 months. That's not how it works. That's not how anything in this world works. You have to like, take your straps and walk the steps and get through each one and then find a level that you can handle. And the difference between what me and you can handle, what somebody who works a labor job versus an elite athlete are all completely different. So comparing it to each other is ridiculous. Like we're doing things during the day and then coaching on online as well, plus family obligations. Whereas an elite athlete who's got unlimited time throughout the week to just train and just do that volume, they would be stupid not to be doing it if they can recover from it because it's their job. If you are working 8 hours a day in an office, commuting there and back, you've got a family at home that you have to look after, and then you're trying to squeeze in 14, 15 hours of training on top of that. You're digging the hole and burying yourself at the same time. So you have to be mindful that these things, if you have to be a weekend warrior where you have to do 2 2-hour sessions on a Saturday and Sunday because they're manageable and that's what you can do and you have to get out a bit earlier, those things work within a context of what you're doing. Bigger picture again with the load. You can have small blocks of weekend warrior style stuff if that suits you better. And there are a couple of papers that look at this that it is actually workable. It's not optimal, but it's workable and we'll see results. But it's in the grand scheme of things. Can you do the work that you're doing now in 12 months' time? If you can and you can't see yourself doing it, then there's no point doing it. Drop back and find a level where you can load or manage the loads to keep going forward. Keep showing up and not showing up completely busted and going through the paces and feeling like you've been run over by a bus. Because if you feel like that, you won't keep doing it. It's not a question of toughness and mental fortitude. Like that is just not sustainable mentally or physically. So what's the point?
Yeah, no, that's very well said. Look, and I think it's one thing to mention. I've said this to people. Is that say you've got, obviously if you're an athlete that has almost infinite time to continue to add volume, load can come in a number of ways. And, you can obviously just do time or duration. But if you're an athlete, like you said, that you are limited to say one session a day, 5 days a week because you work and you've got kids and you can't do a double. Say you've got 70 minutes. And then, maybe on the weekend you can get some longer sessions. You can still continue to add load in those sessions because if you are getting fitter, say for example you're doing a 60-minute run at the start of this year you're running 10 k's an hour. I'm not good at maths, so I'll make this as easy as myself as possible. You're running 10 k's an hour and that's all you can do at the start of the year and that's your easy run. If your fitness improves to the level that your easy run by the end of the year is at 12 k's an hour, you've added 20% more volume in the same time frame. So rather than trying to force additional sessions, additional stress, and then no doubt probably taking time off due to injury, getting sick, set yourself up for long-term progress. Like you said, if you can't adhere to your training plan or if the training plan you are trying to stick to by the end of the week feels like a checklist that is just so cumbersome and over the top, there's no chance that you're going to be doing it in 12 months. So again, pick a plan, pick a work structure, pick a frequency that you feel comfortable doing, which is not to say it should always be easy. Obviously, there needs to be some hard days. But like I said, you can continue to make progress and continue to add load within the same time domain. It works the same for a threshold session. Again, if you've got an hour in the morning with warm up and cool down, where all you can fit in is 30 minutes of threshold running. Again, if you're running 14 kilometers an hour on day one for your threshold session, you're going to run 7 kilometers in 30 minutes. If in 6 months' time you're running 16 kilometers an hour, you're running 8 Ks, which is what, 15 to 17% increase in volume in the same time frame. So even for people listening to this said, look, I'm stuck for time, I'm never going to have more than an hour to train, you can continue and you can manage your load and you can increase volume within that time frame. And as long as you're getting fitter and more efficient, you will increase your volume in terms of the distance covered, without having to add additional training hours.
Yeah, I think that as long as you're within the desired zone and you're not just hammering it because you've got less time, like, oh, I'll send it to zone 5 to,
Yeah.
or I'll go and see God because I've got less time. Because that's not how it works. You don't get fitter just because you've trained harder. We're looking for a physiological adaptation. So for what we're doing, for most people in endurance sport, you're better off doing threshold stuff and hitting that with the easier stuff. So train at threshold or just slightly below it, to push that up. But there's no point in doing it in zone 5 thinking, I run faster, I'll get quicker, because that's not how it works. And we end up in that anaerobic system, and that brings its own problems because of what we're trying to do. So I think we'll talk about that maybe next week, actually. But I had this yesterday, and it was a simple question and I like to do some AMRAPs, and like short AMRAPs, strength endurance AMRAPs within my workout, just for like single modality things. So an easy one's press ups, because you can do 5 sets of AMRAP press ups. The sets will decrease, like the first one will be stronger, but between week to week. So someone said to me, last week I did this many, this week I can only do this many. I said, you need to think about the load around it. So the load before was slightly more than last week. What were the other conditions? It doesn't mean you've got less fit in a week or you're not as good as press ups anymore. It just means that the load that we applied that day was different to what we applied last week. So you trying to progressively overload each week doesn't work in such a micro environment, because there's other things going on. So you might have had a bigger session in the morning, you might be fatigued from the session the day before. So if that fatigue from last week carries on, are we in week 3 of a 4-week block, and you're as opposed to week 1? So the things are completely different. In fact, we were in week 1 and last week was week 4. So last week was a deload week, so the stuff around it was less, so they could do more press ups. This week was less. So just explaining the fact that because you're not doing the same or more than last week doesn't mean that you're not progressing. It just means that the load that day was different. In the holistic whole approach to it, you're still moving forward because you're still doing the work at that level to get those adaptations.
And it may be the case. Sorry, it may be the case. And I've said this to people. Like, there's an analogy. My boss used to use this. Like, I don't know if you get rips up in the UK. Like when you get pulled out to the ocean. Sometimes you just got to accept in life that, like, don't swim against the rip. Let it take you out. So sometimes you are going to have weeks, and you're a client or athlete. People just have to accept that some weeks you're sort of like, but you're just you're letting the rip sort of take you out. You're not trying to make progress against the fucking rip. You're not swimming against it, because all you do is go backwards. Some weeks you have to accept that your fitness will probably stay where it was last week, and that's okay. You don't, as cliche as saying, you can't get 1% better every day. But what you want to avoid, and this comes back to load management, is going backwards. And I think that can be the pitfall that people fall into if they use their program like a checklist. Program is basically the total load that your coach or your training program has given you. But understanding that not all weeks are created equal, and like we said at the start, like, you've got a total amount of stress that your body can ever absorb. And some weeks it might be 30% of what you did last week. But I think I said this in the first episode. What you can do to maintain your current level of fitness is pretty small. And like your athlete, say he did, his AMRAP, he got 5 rounds and he did 5 reps, so he got 25 total reps. And that was a week that perhaps would have given him some adaptation. But this week, if he only got 2 rounds and he got like 10 run backwards, and that's okay.
If the effort's
you're not always going to have weeks where you can make the progress you did last week, but at a bare minimum, you want to avoid going backwards. And obviously, the easiest way to go backwards is to get injured or to overtrain or to get sick often. And that's what you're going to do if you mismanage your load. You see it quite often, people online, like, didn't matter, got the program done, got the work done. It's like, you don't need to wear it like a badge of honor. It's like, like you said, the work's written by 2 blokes sitting behind a laptop in an air-conditioned office going, this is what they can do if everything's perfect. But life is very often not perfect. So you've got to have that ability to regulate your training load when it needs to be regulated, and understand that, yes, you're not always going to make progress in training weeks, but the best thing you can do is to avoid going backwards, because then you take yourself back a further week, and then you've got to make more progress that week. So if people can understand that like, load needs to be applied in conjunction with how the entirety of your stress is going in your life, and don't use your program as a checklist that you feel that you're not worthy enough if you haven't ticked off every session.
Yeah, I think a common mistake that as well is, like we were saying, it's when people start thinking, right, I'm fitter, I can start pushing my easier stuff more, and start pushing it on. I think that's a big misnomer, and I think it's actually the opposite. The fitter you are, I think the easier those easier days probably have to be in between. So, like, making sure that we don't need to keep adding load on because you're getting fitter, making those easier days harder. Like, when you look at it, the more aerobically fit you get, those easier days need to be much easier, because aerobically you can put out higher percentage of power, whether that's pace or bikes or whatever it is. You need to make sure they're easier so that mechanically you're not overstressing yourself. Aerobically you can deal with it, mechanically not. So the fitter you get, the easier you probably need to train in between. So a common mistake I see is people thinking, right, I need to stay in zone 2 now because I'm fitter. That zone 2 is the shit. We'll talk about it probably more actually in another episode, because we could do a full one on this. That easy stuff needs to be even easier the fitter you get, and the more stressed you are, the easier that stuff should be as well, because you're just adding more stress. So I don't think if you've got enough time, or you've got time, I don't think there is too easy. Like, I think you can go, like, if we go back to like the turn of last century, people were doing, that pedestrianism, would go in for long walks and then racing and smashing stuff. So you can develop the aerobic system from a walk all the way up to, VO2 max, eyeballs popping out stuff. This is a spectrum. But I think the fitter you get, the easier your easy days need to be, not harder. So remember that the load aerobically might not equal the mechanical load. So being wary of that, because I think I listened to that Mad Scientist podcast, and Iniaki said that he made the most progress when he realized that he needed to stop doing zone 2 because it was so mechanically stressful, and do loads and loads of zone 1, or as much as he could. And he made so much more progress in zone 1 than zone 2. Zone 2 is just a word. Like, if being below, we'll call it, like, I'd love to just call it zone 1, and it being below, like Steven Siler's stuff, below 2 millimolar lactate. That's hard to manage. So making sure easy is mechanically easy, so that the load is not tied to your heart rate, because it's different the fitter you get. That was...
I'll explain, because I know what you're talking about, but I think that might be missed by some people. So, and you made it, the point is that, the fitter you get, say for a zone 2 run, so for a plotter like myself, like my zone 2 run, I'm slow. For the guys that are getting fitter, that for their zone 2 heart rate to get to a certain level, some of the guys I've coached, their zone 2 run is like 350, 355, and their heart rate is sitting in that sort of 120, 125. But that pace, although it's easy from a physiological standpoint, a metabolic standpoint, it's still quite fast running. But and this is what you're saying, the mechanical load, the body still, is still exposed to quite a high mechanical load, because a 350 pace is still objectively quite fast. The fact that they can do it without the metabolic stress is great, and it's impressive, but it's unnecessary, because, like you said, you're training that aerobic system. I think particularly with impact volume, the fitter you get, particularly your runs, you need to take very, very easy if you are a good runner, because the force you're producing when you're running faster, it goes up in a sort of linear fashion, that the force you're putting through those joints. So I think there's probably a little bit more wiggle room with low impact stuff. So certainly, like the elliptical, if you get your heart rate up, smashing out the elliptical, it's probably not as damaging, same as like the stairs or the bike. But I think especially with the impact volume and the impact load, the fitter you get, the easier that has to be. Otherwise, you run the risk of putting that mechanical stress through the body, when really you're just trying to sort of recover and adapt the aerobic system, and not place unnecessary stress on the joints.
Yeah, that's why cross training is handy, but still, even like if you're sat on a bike or a Stairmaster or whatever you're doing, that's still, if you're able to put out high watts, it's still a mechanical load on the muscles, whatever it is, even if it's less than that jarring of running and that impact. So we have to be mindful of that. And I think planning it is good, but then being dynamic to how you're feeling on that day. Like, if you jump jump on a bike and you're supposed to do a zone 2 and it's supposed to be 200 watts or whatever yours is, and that feels like you're working, but you're like,
Yes.
what's on the plan? Are you just layering on more stress so that tomorrow your quality can't be quality? Because that's what's going to happen. So if you knock that back to 160, 170 watts, you're still going to get some aerobic stress, but it's going to be far less mechanical stress as well. And you're still going to get improvements with that. If we look at one session, the improvements from one session are so minuscule, they're almost, pointless. But when they're all added together, then it makes a difference. So dropping 20 to 30 watts one day in the grand scheme of stuff is like pissing in the ocean. It makes, very little difference in your fitness in the end. So, but layering that on day after day after day after day is just building stress that you can't deliver or you can't build from or handle because you've gone past your capacity. So you just break or end up exhausted, which is probably what we see a lot of at the minute because we just see people trying to hammer everything and trying to get to places faster than their body can get there. And like, you can outwit physiology and human nature. It's, however many hundreds of thousand years we've been around, biology is smarter than us and we just can't do it.
Yeah, I guess that what you said summarizes load management quite well. I mean, the whole point of managing load is basically to allow your hard days to be hard enough that you can actually drive some strong adaptation and then allowing that adaptation to occur. So if you're managing your load in such a way that, your easy days are bleeding into that sort of moderate to slightly hard in any capacity, whether it's mechanical or metabolic, and then your hard days suffer. So then, the days in which you're actually trying to, really upset homeostasis, take your body, say beyond a place it's been in your strength training or improve your threshold running, but, your easy days have bled a little bit hard and a little bit of egos come in, or you jump in on a group session or a group run, you just sort of get this muddled training effect where most days have some semblance of hard, but your hard days really aren't enough to drive progress and adaptation. That's load management in a nutshell. Much like periodization, it's how are you structuring your training week? How are you building a training week, block, year, so that you're making progress? But there's no point. Last week, there's no point putting in 700 to 1,000 hours a week to go backwards. Sort of pointless.
Yeah. I think that actually will lead nicely into my whinge of the week this week and probably yours as well. But it's doing my head in. I don't know how many times I see it. And I had it with a few people recently, turning their workouts into tests and testing themselves to make sure they're ready. Like a race is the test. That is then when you put it all together. You've done all of this training. This is when you test your training. Doing it as a confidence boost in training never really works. Like there is no point going to see God or turning yourself blind in a workout to prove that you're fit to go and race. I know they're expensive and where you are, you don't get that many of them, but you need to have confidence in the training you've done and the way you've built it or the way it's been built for you so that when you get to race day, you're ready. You don't need to go in and do 2 weeks before, I'm going to do a full gas sim just to make sure that I'm ready to race. Like you can do a sim, a couple of weeks before to rehearse, practice your shoes, a slightly different strategy, maybe of how you're going to hit a station or, nutrition and stuff like that. That's a rehearsal and you can train that. And it doesn't have to be at full gas. You can put breaks in, just train a strategy. Whereas if you go and just race a full sim 2 weeks before, 10 days before, you're basically racing your race before your race. So it's stupid. And the thing, you get no real benefit out of that. And to be honest, it's probably completely counterproductive. Either it goes really, really well and sims are never the same, you get a false sense of security, or it goes shit and then you don't have confidence in training anyway. So it's lose-lose for me. If use it as a rehearsal and a little bit of a way to test out maybe a different strategy, if you want to do that, go in and push the sled in a different makeup when you're at a higher intensity that's similar, and how do you react after that? Fine, but you can do that in other types of workouts. But all of these workouts where you need to train really, really hard to make sure that you're fit, or you need to go to that place in training to test your mental toughness for the race, you do not. You need to leave that and leave your matches unstruck until you get to the race, and then you get to come do them all and burn everything and burn all the boats and David Goggins after it. But don't do it in training because it's too much load above what you do, especially if it's not programmed. And then afterwards you leave a comment that, saying that you were doing it just to test to make sure you're ready, because it means you haven't got confidence in the coach or your program or yourself, which isn't healthy. Just have confidence in what you're doing, that you're ready to go on race day so that you can apply all of that training you've done, because it's way better doing it in a race than it is in a gym on your own, where nobody can see you and nobody's going to be able to post it to the Instagram for you.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree, and it's probably it's something I've actually would be something I've changed my opinion. I think I used to get athletes to do a sim, whatever it was, 3 weeks before. It's now just, I think I try to put a lot more thought into everything I program. And every workout needs to make sense. And like you said, the sim either goes well, and it could go well for a number of reasons. One, you might just have the fitness, in which case you would have had the fitness on race day. It might have gone well because the sim was set up, the sleds were really easy, the runs were short, any number of reasons. It goes well. Very often that can then lead to overconfidence. Well, I ran a 61 in a sim. I'm definitely on for a sub 60, and overconfidence is probably one of the worst things to have in a Hyrox race. Or like you said, it goes poorly, and it could go poorly for a number of reasons. Hopefully, if you're working with one of us, it's not because you don't have the fitness, but it can be hot. The sleds can be sticky. You can run outside. Any number of reasons, you can just race poorly, and then it crushes your confidence, and then basically just doubting yourself for the next 2 weeks, which is not a good it's not a good environment to be training. Again, you're right. You need to back your fitness. You need to back it is cliche, but you've got to trust the process. You've got to know that what you're doing is improving your fitness, and then go out and try to express that fitness on race day. It's obviously not always going to go well. Just that's the nature of the sport. You're not always going to race well, but you've always got to have confidence that your fitness is going to put you in a good position to at least have the ability to have a good race. And when it goes well, it's great. When it doesn't go well, it sucks for a few days, and then you just get back to doing the work. But that is definitely one thing I've changed my opinion. I see 0 point in running a full sim 2 weeks before. You're either going to run it within your capacity, in which case you're sort of doing this long threshold session that probably could have been structured a bit better, where everything was more controlled, or you absolutely sell your soul and then you create an hour of overload, in which case you disrupt the next training week. So to me, it doesn't make sense in the scheme of a block to run a full sim when you can just structure a training session to get exactly the stimulus and ideally the response you want. Like you said, you've got to have confidence that the last 10, 12, 16 weeks of work that you've put in has put you in a good position to run a good race.
Yeah. I think the rehearsal sometimes is good for the confidence, but not at full steam and not not racing your race before. Especially if you're new to it and you haven't been through the full run through. If you've never done a Hyrox before, do a full run through. Just do it a tad under, a good tempo effort, or even less, and practice all of your stuff for the day and how you're going to do, and just getting the right mindset. But then sending it and making it a full race, what's the point? You've got the race, and that's the race, and you've spent 130 quid or whatever it is now to enter it. So don't waste your money by burning your boats before you even get to the race.
Great, good whinge.
What you got?
What fucking don't I have? It's just all these peanuts online that undervalue zone 2 and aerobic capacity, and if you've only got 5 hours that everyone should be doing higher intensity, or probably had a little bit too much time on my hands last week and jumped into someone's comment section, said that basically the 80-20 principle was just bunk, and said I sort of went down that rabbit hole for a bit, and I've become even more convinced that if someone only had 5 or 6 hours a week, basically all they should be doing is easy work and trying to build the biggest base they can, and actually build aerobic capacity. Because, and I'm sure you've had this experience, most people that are doing F45, that group style training, they're really glycolytically trained. They've got terrible aerobic capacity. Most people that come to my Hyrox classes, and I try to make them much more, that low end conditioning or capacity work, just absolutely melt, because they're actually forced to do a sustained effort using their aerobic system, and they're so those classes are just so glycolytically orientated that you're doing 30-40 seconds high intensity, and you rest for 30 times. It's not training your aerobic system. So that's definitely my whinge of the week. People that think zone 2 work is only valuable if you've got 20 hours a week to train. I think most people should be doing, if they're interested in running a Hyrox race and feeling competent doing it, should be basically all easy work, a little bit of station work. Because think about it, you know, most people in their first Hyrox race are going to be out there for 90 minutes. You don't want to be like glycolytic for 90 minutes. You're going to be an absolute hole. But
You can.
you know it better than I. Like, it's just going to be a horrible event if you're out there for 90 minutes, like using a glycolytic system, then just recovering slowly. Like, build a base. I think I get the compliance thing. If all you did was easy work, you probably would get a bit bored. And some higher intensity stuff's probably fun and good for compliance. But if I had two people and you said, get this person the most race ready with basically no training, and they had 5 or 6 hours a week, the vast majority, if not the entirety of their training would be easy work, and actually getting their slow twitch fibers actually working aerobically. At the end of the day, they're going to have a better race doing it that way. Because if all they're doing is, you know, tapping into their anaerobic system, every time they run or push a sled, they're just going to be walking, stopping for the sled, 9-minute burpees.
I think we'll do this for next week, but I think, you know, you don't need that much high intensity stuff to get improvements from it. Like, you can, if you've got 5 or 6 hours, you probably only need to do 20 minutes of lactate threshold stuff in that week. And I think we need to talk about it as though, when we do it next week, that we're talking easy aerobic, let's call it cardio, right? So we class our strength and strength endurance stuff as hard quality stuff, but
yeah,
wouldn't class it as, we'll call it separate, unless, you know, you put in a little bit of a kind of workout in there, but
sure.
Like they are separate. So if we just, I think it's important to separate that we're only really talking about, for want of a better word, cardio or type exercises in there. So we're not talking about that strength being easy as well. That needs to be to a certain level to get the right stimulus. So they're different things. But I think, you know, like these longer ones that I do that are in zone 2, zone 3, like I would have just them doing that so they can build up, be out there in their training for 90 minutes, feeling what it's like. Because really, you're going to only be racing at that. So why would you race higher? It's another with that false sense of security where, all right, I've been hammering it in zone 11 out of 10, and so I can handle that. By the end of the ski, I should be feeling like shit. You absolutely should not be feeling that way. You should be feeling in control for the majority of the race, because it's a threshold race. If you're out of control and chaotic, even in doubles, there's elements of chaos within it, but it's controlled chaos where you know you can repeat that action. So if by the end of the ski or the sleds you are huffing and puffing and can't recover, like, that's because you've either paced it like a turnip, or you don't have the aerobic flexibility to recover within that time to be able to go again. Also a pacing issue, but like it's an aerobic capacity and durability thing. So the bigger your aerobic base, which only really comes through doing easy stuff, the more productive you're going to be and the better your results are going to be in Hyrox. But it doesn't work it doesn't work overnight, and it takes time and it takes patience, and people don't have it in this world of instant. Like, I can pick up my phone now and order some pants online, they'll be in my letterbox tomorrow morning. So yeah, like, we just need to realize that these things take time, and you can get an instant or a really short spout of 8 or 12 weeks where you hammer somebody and they'll get amazing results, but then what? Where do you go after that? That's their ceiling. They've hit their ceiling, they fucking headbutted it, and they're stuck there. So we need to push the ceiling up and bring the floor to the ceiling by doing more and more aerobic stuff there, because there's nowhere else you can go. And that ceiling will only go so high because of the physiological genetic element where we're predisposed to be there. And you can thank your parents or not for having that ceiling.
Well, that leads perfectly into the questions of the week. Do you think individuals have a performance ceiling?
So the ceiling is predominantly set by genetics, yes, but we can bring the floor so close to that ceiling, and then we can edge the ceiling up slightly that we can constantly progress. And by slight manipulation of things, even more in Hyrox than a cyclical thing like cycling or running, we've got more possibilities to improve. So I think the ability to keep going and getting better in Hyrox is more than a cyclical sport like those two I just mentioned, or even swimming or whatever. So I think because there are the different elements, we can always improve somewhere to get that ceiling moving higher. So at the end of the day, if you could train for every single hour in the week, which nobody can, but you would eventually hit a ceiling where you can't get any better, or there would be so tiny gains that it would be almost like what's the word? It wouldn't be worth it. Like there would just be no point. You would just be doing it for the sake of it. So yes, there's a ceiling. Are many people anywhere near it in a general population? Probably not, because they can add in more volume, they can add in more intensity over time, which takes years. I think of like an aerobic engine as getting good gains for at least 10 years. Like you can keep pushing your threshold up for probably 3 or 4 years to get close to it, and then you have to go up again. But because of our different modalities, we can change things and target different areas to bring that up so that we could. It is very high in Hyrox is my point, but there is a ceiling. But there are ways to keep manipulating things to keep going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think like you said, I think the ceiling is mostly genetic. Again, the people who do best in Hyrox are people that had great choice in their parents and are predominantly slow twitch muscle, have a predominantly slow twitch fibers. They're going to be better in endurance. Again, would Usain Bolt ever be able to get as good as Ronkovic in Hyrox, even though he's the best sprinter in the world? No, because he's so fast twitch dominant. So there's definitely a genetic ceiling. But even with that being said, you can still train the slow twitch fibers. You have to be more efficient, and you can train the fast twitch fibers to act better in an aerobic environment. And yeah, I think yes, of course there is a ceiling. Yeah, even if you put someone from birth, like the Russians and the Chinese do, there is a ceiling with everything. I don't think anyone listening to this is anywhere near it. Just given the, I guess, say the infancy of the sport, and you can see the progress that people are making pretty quickly now. I think a lot of people have a pretty good idea of how to train for it. Obviously, that ceiling is getting closer for some people. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the world record will be in say 3 years' time. I don't think it's going to improve at the rate it has. I can't see a solo person ever going sub 50 or perhaps even sub 51, but so people are certainly getting there. And the closer you get to your ceiling, the slower the gains happen. But yeah, for the majority of people listening to this, you're probably nowhere near it, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, agreed. It will plateau off, and there will be that the same as all the other sports. We're getting close to human capabilities, or maximal capabilities.
Yeah, the limitations of human performance.
Yeah, that's it. Better English. For like Hyrox, I think that we've still a way to go. Once people start coming from other sports that have got these, like I reckon if you gave Blumenfeld 2 years to train for this, it would be ridiculous. But like, it's always going to be that way. He could have done any sport he wanted because he's predominantly slow twitch with a little bit of that power stuff, and his VO2 max is fucking off the charts. So they told him he could be any Olympic champion of any sport. So that's just the way the genetic cookie crumbles, unfortunately, and we'll just have to be mediocre forever. So I get actually this one. I don't know if what do you use for benchmarking to start your programming, or to benchmark along the way to see improvements if you do?
I get asked this a bit too, and maybe it sounds a bit naive. I don't do any performance testing other than looking at people's last race, and we sort of talked about this. The race is the ultimate. Hyrox is a fitness test, so there are some people I'll do a bike FTP with if I think programming a fair bit of bike will be beneficial. But yeah, I don't do strength testing. Some people have come to me with lactic testing for their threshold pace, which is handy. But as everyone knows, I use Morpheus, and it's very good at ascertaining someone's threshold pace. So most of it is done looking at their last race, which is obviously the expression of their fitness at that point in time, and you can obviously make some pretty reasonable inferences from what they've done well. If they've raced well, if they've had not a lot of drift between their runs and their stations pretty solid, you just look to improve fitness generally. If their runs were really bad and they know running's bad, you obviously just work on their running more than their strength endurance, and vice versa. If they ran really well but they fell apart the sleds, you would focus more on strength endurance. In my mind, there's no test I could do that would give me better insight into what if they've got a number of races and if they're consistently doing the same thing, what they're doing well or not so well, and what they need to work on. If they've come to me and they've never raced before, it would just be general programming. Again, nothing. Doing a 5K ski isn't going to tell me probably how they're going to perform. Yeah, it's probably not the answer some people want to hear, but yeah, I don't do a lot of testing because it's really not going to change how I program for an athlete.
So someone asked me the other day, these are my times, how good will I be at Hyrox? Yeah. I said, I don't fucking know, mate. Like, those times mean nothing towards... He asked me because I just tested him. tested him, and I get that you want to look at them and go, oh, well, how good? Like, I looked at his time and said, you've got a good aerobic capacity. You have potential to do well if you apply the right stimulus and we get the right results. I do baseline testing at the beginning of the programs because I use them to set certain things. I also then don't shut up about effort, and like someone's going to start calling me effort Aaron or something stupid soon. Like RPE for me is gold because we race to RPE, and if you don't understand your body, you don't listen to your body, like you're not going to know. But I do a 20-minute FTP for most of the people that train twice a day because most of my supplementary stuff is on a bike, and I want to make sure that they're not overcooking it. Like I know I said effort earlier, but effort, like I said last week, the triangle, effort, heart rate, and pace or watts all go together to form where you should be at from understanding your body. All right. So I do FTP or a 20-minute test. It's not FTP, and then I work it out with some experience and whatever I want, and then set their watts off of templates. And then I do some strength testing at the beginning just to get a number so that I can roughly give them a percentage of 1 RM to work off but then I still base it off effort. And sometimes I use I like to use Wendler stuff. So, build up and then do an AMRAP at the end off of 90% of 100%. So he cut 10% off everything. I'm sure you know, but I like to use that because I think you can get the AMRAP up at a decent weight. And if you're AMRAP in strength, you're going to start recruiting a fuckload of type 2 muscle fibers. Yeah. And that way you get a stimulus without doing too much strength, I think. So anywhere close to that if you're working towards near failure anyway, you're going to get a stimulus from a strength point of view, whether it's 30% 1 rep max or 80% at 1 rep max, whatever. You're going to get something. At the end of the day, I think we both agree maximal strength isn't a massive underlying factor in performance in Hyrox, but I see benefits to it for other things like robustness and injury prevention, and just people like doing it and still won't unhook from the fact that they think it's a performance enhancer for this. So maybe there is, we don't know, but from my experience, it isn't that much of a thing. And then I do both the ARGs, lucky people, 2K on both of them, only to set paces again for workouts, and mainly easy workouts and some harder stuff. But I also like to use the ski 2 ARG time because after hundreds of people and 40 odd races of myself, I kind of know how fast you should ski to not overcook it. And everyone's slightly different, so I give a window, and the more experienced you are, the faster you can go, but there's still diminishing returns on that. Going 2 seconds per 500 faster puts you red line before you've got to the sleds is stupid. I think we'll do an episode on race strategy, but yeah. And then the last one I do is 5K time trial, and I do that just to give me a rough idea of where I think their threshold 1 and 2 should be. And their guesstimates off a lot of experience and a lot of reading and a lot of it taken, and I wiggled it between stuff that Jack Daniels did and a fight singer as well. And basically me being a runner for what feels like my whole personality now, of whatever it is, 12 years. So I use them as guides. But like I said last week, effort over pace and heart rate every time. So what might feel like a 7 today might be a 6 next week, and it might be an 8 the week after. And if it's an 8, you better fucking slow down, because that's not what we're looking for. And that's all I keep reinforcing. I think it's nice to have these numbers. And when can I retest my 5K now? I feel like it's too slow. Okay, let's maybe retest it, and just to get the paces. But like I can kind of just take a few seconds off the pace anyway, but it makes it nice and clean if we retest it. But I don't retest very often. Like you say, the race is the test, and then it's easy for me to go in and look at what their results are, look at the stations that they struggled on, which is also a bit of it's a kind of a double-edged sword, that, because you might look at it and go, right, they were shit in the lunges or they were shit in the wall balls. Nearly everybody starting's crap at wall balls, because not that they're shit at wall balls, because of their capacity and their resilience, and they paced it like a plonker. So another point, but I think if you're looking at it and it's took you 6 minutes for the wall balls and you think, I'm just rubbish at wall balls, it's probably a capacity and a pacing thing over wall balls. Because if I gave you a wall ball now, or even you ran for a 2K pretty solid and I threw you a wall ball, you'd get 80, 90, maybe 100, whatever more done. If you can't do them fresh and train them, then it's a different matter. But like if you can do 100, 120 fresh wall balls, which, to be honest, at open weight, most people probably could. At pro, all right. Although I think the predisposing stuff before we get to the wall balls is what makes the problem. So I think you have to take those the high results and the rocks fit and the where they came on each station with a pinch of salt because of where that is in the race. So you can see that over if you look at a couple of different races, I think, and also just talking to them, like, how did that go? What do you think went well? What do you think went badly? And why? Why? And most of the time it go, well, I got carried away.
Yeah, went out too high.
Yeah, which then also just skews all your data for the back end of the race. But this is a learning sport, and we're still new, and everyone is. And well, if you got 1 in 10 races perfectly, you'd be up there, because it doesn't happen. And I think it's what keeps people coming back so often, is because there's so much data and there's so many little things you can tinker with, and you think, fuck, now I could have done better there, should have done this better, I'll get another go. And you do get another go. You don't get as many goes as we do up here. We get loads. So I think that brings that wrap us up nicely, I think, unless you've got anything to add.
No, I think that's all I've got for this week.
I think a couple of races this weekend. So Nice and the first one in Turkey. So Istanbul starts Friday, I think. So ready to crack them out. I don't know. I didn't check that preparation. I didn't check what else is on, but definitely those two. And I'm sure there's more around the world. Cool. All right. We'll do that aerobic capacity in zone 2 next week, I think, which should build on nicely from this. And I think there's some fair ramblings in there, so hopefully people can pull some bits and pieces out.
Very good.
All right, mate. I'll speak to you next week.
Thanks, mate.